Hello, I am Marissa Fowler.
And I'm Morgan Johnson, and we're both senior history majors at Meredith. And last summer, we did a big research project on the suffrage movement in North Carolina's women's colleges. And this whole school year, we've been working on different final products related to that project. And these past few weeks, we've missed out on a few different events we were supposed to use this research for. So we were going to have a library exhibit, and we were going to present at the suffrage symposium on campus. But obviously those things aren't happening now. So for our CSA Day presentation, we just thought we would combine those different things we're missing out on. So we're going to use primary sources at Meredith specifically to tell you about a little bit about the suffrage movement in North Carolina.
The materials that we pulled from in this presentation today are the same ones that we looked at for all the primary sources at Meredith, and these include 3 campus publications. The Oak Leaves, which we still have today, is the yearbook. The Acorn is more of a literary magazine, so students would write stories, articles, and poems and submit to that, and it was published once a year. And then the Meredith College Quarterly Bulletin was basically a news source about the students, campus, and alumna.
So for research, we decided to start looking at these primary sources in 1910. That's because in North Carolina, the suffrage movement was pretty slow to gain speed. The first statewide suffrage league wasn't established until 1913. So we figured at women's colleges, we probably wouldn't find anything before 1910. And also it's just a nice round number to start with. So that's why we started then. And then the first reference to suffrage you really find at Meredith is this political cartoon from the Oak Leaves in 1910. And on the left here, we have John Bull, who is basically the UK's version of Uncle Sam. And so he's sitting here relieved that the suffragist in the middle, who has quite an angry face, is finally taking her cause over to the United States, who is obviously here represented by Uncle Sam. And so even though this piece isn't strictly pro or anti-suffrage, it at least shows that Meredith students were aware of the movement if this was going to show up in the yearbook.
Like in 1910, we didn't have any direct suffrage materials, but we did have this piece from the Acorn, and it advocates for students to be more active in their daily engagement with current events and political systems. So basically, encouraging students to be more aware of the world around them. And though this wasn't pro-suffrage, it was preparing students to be politically active in the future.
So in 1912, that's a presidential election year, obviously, and we saw the first of many mock elections on Meredith's campus. And so these were held usually by like the literary societies on campus, which were some of the largest organizations on campus. And in this mock election, Roosevelt won. And even though, again, it is not talking about women's suffrage specifically, obviously students have to be informed on modern politics to be able to put something like this on. And these types of events clearly show that students had the ability to vote if they were just granted that right.
In 1913, many women across the country did have the ability to vote, and one of those was an alumna who lived in Colorado. And she addressed this writing to the Acorn about her experiences in a community where women could vote. She discussed how voting election days went and how voting improved the community. And this informed Meredith students that even though North Carolina didn't have suffrage for women yet, many women could vote, and it was a positive force for change. The same year, we also saw that the literary societies had a debate about women's suffrage. The literary societies had a debate about once a semester, but this is the first time that their topic was on women's suffrage, and according to the write-up, it was very popular and controversial. There was a lot of enthusiasm from the students about women's suffrage and the topic at hand. But this also allowed students to become educated on the subject as they prepared for their debate.
So in 1914, Meredith had a visit from North Carolina Supreme Court Chief Justice Walter Clark, and his visit is pretty interesting. So he came to campus and he talked about women's suffrage. Walter Clark was one of the most prominent male suffragists in North Carolina at that time. And what's perhaps more interesting about his visit is that Walter Clark was also a known white supremacist. And so white supremacist arguments were important on both sides of the suffrage movement at this time. So anti-suffragists might argue that they don't want Black women to vote. So if you give all women the right to vote, you're opening the door to Black women voting, obviously. And then pro-suffragists might argue that with giving white women the right to vote, that you would cement white supremacy in the South, and the white woman's vote could help make that happen. And pro-suffragists would also say that we'll just keep Black women from voting the same way we keep Black men from voting. So that's through policies such as literacy tests or poll taxes. And so these were the kind of arguments that Walter Clark as a pro-suffragist would use. And so even though at Meredith and other women's colleges, we never really saw strong anti-suffrage arguments or strong suffrage arguments related to white supremacy, Walter Clark's visit to Meredith at least shows that students were probably, at the very least, aware of these kinds of arguments.
1915 was somewhat of a turning point for suffrage support at Meredith. It really started to pick up. And we can see this in this image from the oak leaves. Each class got to pick one image to represent their class that year, and the senior class picked this image of some angels in the background who are heralding the message of suffrage. They are supporting votes for women, and that represents the fact that the majority of the class saw themselves as suffragists. Traditions at Meredith are still very important, and they were back in 1915 as well. In this year, the junior class stunt theme was Man Suffrage, a parody of the women's suffrage movement. And they incorporated the same arguments that men used against women's suffrage at the time, including the fact that it would corrupt men, it would ruin family life. And the way that they spun this showed that they were not only supporters of suffrage, but they understood the problems that women were facing at the time and how kind of ridiculous they were. This image is of the Equal Rights for Women Club, which existed in 1915. This is from the yearbook, and in it, the students involved were dressed up as all different types of women, women in different careers, and women who may have just been a wife and a homemaker. And this was the first club on campus that directly supported women's rights. And though it wasn't a suffrage organization, it was the first time that we saw an organization of activism for women. And it prepared the student body for later organizations that may have been more directly related to suffrage. This is a humorous piece from the Oak Leaves, and it was of a typical student's notes in class. And you can see she starts off being very focused on the subject at hand and quickly begins thinking about suffrage leader Dr. Anna Howard Shaw and women's rights in North Carolina. And so this represents that students were very much engaged with the suffrage movement. The typical student was thinking about it a lot. And this is just presented in a humorous way.
So in 1916, we still see this really strong presence of suffrage on campus through these primary sources. And so this is a senior profile page from the class of 1916, and this is Bert, and she's from Asheville, and her profile identifies her as a suffragist on campus. And this is just one example of how sometimes it's nice to put a face to these names of these students who we knew were active in the movement on campus. And in that same Oak Leaves, for the Superlative Page that year, they created this really interesting 3D element. And so this is a ballot box that says Votes for Women on it. And we have the superlatives sort of going into the ballot box as a ballot. And more interestingly, at the bottom here, we have I. Thompson, who is voted as most suffragetical on campus. And so this is just another example of how suffrage was being injected into these traditions and normal events on campus. And this is a short story that was also published in the Oak Leaves that year, written by a student on campus. And it's about a Meredith student who comes home from Raleigh. And when her dad comes to pick her up to take her home, she has just become this very militant suffragette and doesn't want his help at all. And this is another example of a humorous take on suffrage. So at Meredith and other women's colleges, in our research, we didn't find that there was often a lot of anti-suffrage happening on campus, but there were these sort of humorous takes on suffrage that played up on these stereotypes of what being a suffragist would do to you. It would kind of defeminize you. And so this story is just one example of that.
In 1917, we had a few more self-identifying suffragist students, and this senior profile was Lilia Higgs, and each student had a brain that they could choose what was inside it to represent the important parts of their life, and she chose to include a suffragist illustration in the corner, and she was also voted most suffragistical in that year's superlatives, which was interesting, just showing again that suffrage sort of was interjected into all aspects of life at Meredith. And then we had another student, Sophia Knott, who also said she was interested in women's suffrage in her brain.
So in 1918, we have this really cool resource in the Oak Leaves, and that is this really detailed description of the Class Day exercises that year. And it included an entire script of the Class Day skit. And so 1918, obviously, this is during World War I. And so the skit took on this very patriotic theme. And so later on in the skit, there's this character called the Eagle who comes in, and he is trying to help these new graduates find jobs that are befitting of them. And so in this skit, one of the jobs he offers up is working for equal suffrage for women. And so two students come forward and are like, I think I'd be really good at this. And these students were Letty Howard and Carmen Rogers. And so these were, although they were characters in the skit, they were actually students on campus who we assume were involved in the suffrage movement. And so this is probably one of the more famous images relating to suffrage from Meredith. This is the Equal Suffrage League. What's really significant about it is that it's one of the largest organizations on campus that we found in our research that wasn't a literary society or wasn't the YWCA. And so here we've just blown up the image of the club from the yearbook, but on that same page in the yearbook, what's really great is that we have a list of all the students that appear in this photo. And so we use that information and also the list of students that were in the Equal Rights for Women's Club earlier on in this decade, and any other students who we found, individuals in the yearbook that were involved in suffrage. We used all that information to make this map. And so we used the hometowns of all these students and organized them by county. And so the darker the county is on this map, the more students that came from that county that were involved in suffrage. And so the darkest two counties are Buncombe here in the western part of the state. So that's where Asheville is. So that makes perfect sense because Asheville was one of the larger cities in the state at that time. And then interestingly, the county that had the most suffragists was Robeson. And Robeson doesn't have a ton of big cities. You know, it's not Mecklenburg, it's not Charlotte, it's not Wake County, it's not Raleigh, it's Robeson County. And so that was just sort of interesting. And this, it's nice to visualize this data in this way. And it shows that suffragists at Meredith were coming from all over the state. You know, this is 1918, so this is just one example of how the suffrage movement has really grown and spread over this decade that we've looked at.
We had another student, Madelyn Higgs, who was noted for being a suffragist. This time it wasn't necessarily from her own perspective, but that other students were including a write-up about her in the Oak Leaves that celebrated her activism as a suffragist on campus and the way that she spread the most equal suffrage propaganda around campus, which was important because she was educating other students and spreading the word on suffrage that paralleled the growth on campus as the suffrage movement moved towards the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
So now we've made it to 1920. It's finally the year that the 19th Amendment is ratified and added to the Constitution. So in this year, we find that students were anxiously keeping up with what was happening with the amendment. So this is a piece from the Acorn earlier in 1920. And it's just giving an update on where the amendment's at. We have 34 states that have ratified it. We need 2 more. But what's interesting about this piece is at the end, it asks the question, how many of us have seriously thought about who will be the best to direct the affairs of our state and nation? And so this sort of attitude or just like wanting other students to be politically active and be informed, we see that a lot at women's colleges all over the state at this time, not just Meredith. And so this is another piece from the Acorn in May of 1920. So the 19th Amendment is added to the Constitution in August. So we're getting really close here. And this piece is celebrating that the Democratic Party in North Carolina has officially given their support to the women's suffrage issue. And so the students are celebrating that. And what's interesting about North Carolina is, so we have this update in May that the Democratic Party in the state is supporting suffrage. But we know that in August, North Carolina votes against the amendment. And then Tennessee, a few weeks later, votes on it and becomes that last state needed to ratify the amendment. And so obviously all the work of these students was not in vain, but it does sort of show how North Carolina is really unique. Obviously there are women in the state like Meredith students who supported the movement, but North Carolina is still a southern state full of white supremacy, full of misogyny, and it's a really interesting area to look at, and we're really lucky to have all of these great primary sources from Meredith to be able to study this time in history. So we'd like to thank, before we go, we'd like to thank Dr. Robbins, who is our research advisor for this project. And we also like to thank Janice Sniker, who is one of the archivists at Meredith. And during all this chaos, she actually is able to go into campus and get some scans of those Acorn materials for us to use in this presentation. So thank you.